Ancient Somalis seems to have been very good at building very complex water supply systems. The document I'm reading at the moment is part of the book that has several articles that were written between 1830 and 1890 and published by the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society of London. Now, this article is written by one Lieutenant Charles John Cruttenden. Now, John Cruttenden is somebody I've read his articles before, and this is a gentleman who was born around 1815, a while back, a very long time ago, and he visited the Horn of Africa between 1843 and 1848. There are two articles written by Cruttenden in this book, and this is the first article, the one that we are going to read in this video. Now, this article is titled Memoir on the Western or Dor tribes inhabiting Somali coast of Northeast Africa with the southern branches of the family of Darod, resident on the banks of the Webe Shebeli, commonly called the River Webe. This was published in 1848 as a part of the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society of London. Now, besides telling us about the very complex water supply systems that were found in the Horn of Africa in 1840s or 1830s, or before then, of course, he found them to be like very old structures in place. He tells us about the people. Of course, the article discusses a lot about the different branches of the Somali people, the different clans and sub-clans and how they are related and things like that. He also tells us about the wealth of the Somali. There's a part that he says something very interesting, and I'm going to read that specific part where it tells us how immensely wealthy some of the Somalis were. And we are talking immensely wealthy, and he gives us some numbers, and they are mind-boggling, actually. He tells us about the wildlife and the birds that were found in that land. Of course, it's talking about what is known today as Somaliland, but also parts of what is known today as Ogaden, and also southern Somalia, actually. Of course, he discusses the valley of the Webi Shebeli. And of course, he brings up ancient ruins, and this is something I've talked about here and there. He talks about the ancient ruins that were found on the lands of the Somalis. He also tells us about the plants, of course, the flora, of course, generally the flora and fauna of the land. Very interesting, different animals of the land. And of course, there is this topic that keeps coming up when you read these old documents about the Horn of Africa, and that is the Berbera annual trade fair. Very interesting. He describes it in detail. He basically paints a picture of all these people coming from different parts of the ancient world, from India, from Yemen, from Arabia in general, from Turkey, from all these places. They come to this part of the Horn of Africa during some months of the year, and then people will be trading, selling, and buying. He paints a very interesting picture about that. Now, he also mentions Harar. Of course, he writes it as Hurur, and that's something I pointed out in the other videos. He talks about it, and he points out something that I found to be very interesting, because he tells us about the specific clans of the Somalis that did have a lot of, we could say, the blood in the leadership of the Harar, the government, and the royal family, to be specific. He tells us about a specific clans of the Somalis that did contribute significantly, you can say, blood into that royal family. And I'm going to read that part. Now, let's start with reading about how wealthy some of the Somalis were. And this is what he writes about that. He says, the number of sheep, goats, she camels, etc. found on these plains, and he's talking about specifically the lands of the Ogaden and around that region, is perfectly incredible, fully realizing the account given of the flocks and herds of the patriarchs of old. For many of the elders of these tribes own each more than 1,500 she-camels, and their sheep are innumerable. Asses are very numerous and most admirably adapted to the country. So, counting only she-camels, not all the camels, you'll find an individual having as many as 1,500. Now, you can include the bulls, I don't know whether that's what they are called, then you'll have a significant amount of camels. And then, of course, there are the sheep and the goats and the donkeys. So these people used to have a lot of animals, and that was huge wealth that they carried around with them. Now, let's talk about the water supply systems. Now, he discusses going to Zeila, and he explores the land around trying to figure out where the water used to come from. At this point, Zeila seems like it's declining. It's not like it's at its height. And he goes looking around because he realizes that the place did not have good water for consumption. And he's directed to these systems, aqueducts, that he then follows. And they go all the way to hills that are like 7 miles away. That's a long distance. And he follows those aqueducts and they direct him to that place. And I've read this part in another video, so I'm not going to read this part. And then he describes the material that was used, I think is limestone and other materials that was used to build those systems. But then he makes a very interesting comment about it. And that is, he seemed not to have believed that the people who were there then, the Somalis, were the ones who built those systems. He arrives at the conclusion that those systems must have been built by other people, another nation, and he seems to suggest that it will be very interesting to figure out who those people were. Now, but that was not the only place where he saw these complex water supply systems. He found it in another place also. He writes, the distance of Beyegora from the sea is not great, perhaps 6 miles, and I have been assured by several respectable natives that on the seashore north of Beyegora, and at the spot where its water are discharged into the sea after heavy rains, the remains of an ancient reservoir and aqueduct are to be found, similar to that previously described as extending from Budhar to Berbera. Now, it wasn't Zayla actually, the first one, it was Berbera. So he discusses, or he tells us that he went to another place called Beyegora, and he was told of the same water supply system, very complex. Now, let's talk about Harar. He talks about it. He tells us a lot about that city. He writes it as a Rur, of course, as I said. But then he tells us about the ruling class of that city. Cruttenden goes into that very sensitive topic of the ethnicity of the emir and the ruling family of Harar. And this is what he writes. Again, I need to caution that we shouldn't take these writings to be like they are the truth, complete truth. We should just look at this content as another perspective that we can interrogate and maybe compare with other perspectives. So it's very important to do that. This is what he writes. The emirs of Hurur have for many years intermarried with the Burtirhi, and this gives them a certain degree of influence, but they do not visit the seacoast so commonly as the other tribes, and appear to be pastoral race, occupied solely in tending flocks and herds in the planting the coffee tree on the low range of southeast of Hurur. So he talks about the Burtirhi, which I understand could be a clan or a sub-clan of the Somali. He talks about there being a huge intermarriage between that ruling royal family and Somali clans and sub-clans, however you can look at them. From that, we can conclude that the emirs of Harar did have a lot of blood, we can say, from those groups of the Somalis. But that leaves us with the impression that they were not entirely of the Somali stock. Maybe they were Turks who intermarried with Somalis, could be Arabs, but most of the documents I've seen tend to lean on them being of Turkish origin. That's what I've seen. That's what I've seen happening a lot. That they were initially, their ancestors were of Turkish, but they intermarried with the locals, and we can guess, of course, with these Burtirhi people, and then that became the ruling family of the city of Harar. So this is a very interesting article. It's a very long article. I've just chose to summarize it somehow. I'm going to do in the next video, I'm going to do a video about the other article. And this is the one, Cruttenden is the only person who has 2 articles in this book. I'm going to read the other article by him. It's a short article, it's not very long article, but also very interesting actually. So if you want to buy this book, you can get it on Amazon. Check the description box or the pinned comment if you are watching on YouTube. And if you are watching on TikTok, check the bio. You can go there, you can get a link. But I don't want you to buy the book and keep it, because very many people have that weakness, myself included. Sometimes you buy a very good book, you just keep it there. Go read the book actually. Find time. You might be very busy with whatever, business, work, whatever, but just find a moment and read it. Again, you need to read these articles in the right context. Don't misread them in the wrong context so that you get the wrong impressions. And also, just take them to be just another perspective you can pick, and then get other perspectives from other sources, and then you compare. That's how you do a good research. You can say you get from opposing sort of sources, and then you just find the truth by yourself. You don't rely on any of them to be, this is the truth, this is the truth. No, you get different sources, and then you come to the conclusion by yourself as this is possibly what it could be. And sometimes you might not even get any truth anyway. You might conclude that there's no truth, and that's okay, because you have exercised something about trying to look for the truth, historical truth, that is. Yeah, so those are my random thoughts.